development of imperialism, in Part 1. My lecture will be episodic today, an interpolation of sorts into our other considerations. The reason is that our English friends will soon be returning to their home country, and I would like them to have a lot to take back from their time here. To that end, I will deliver my considerations today, such that one aspect or another might serve to support the necessary effectiveness of these words. Also, to that end, I want to address a few things about imperialism today, specifically looking at it historically from a spiritual scientific historical perspective, rather than examining imperialism in the present. That can perhaps come tomorrow. Imperialism is a phenomenon that has been spoken of often nowadays, and there is a more or less clear awareness in those who speak about it of its connection with the collective phenomena of contemporary social life. But when people do speak about these sorts of things, they do not consider, at least not sufficiently, that we all are living in the stream of humanity's history, that we are standing in the midst of a very particular evolutionary epoch, and that we can understand this evolutionary epoch only when we know from whence come the phenomena that currently surround us, in whose midst we are currently living. The effective imperialism of today, and it will be effective into the future, which is practiced by the English American peoples, and is essentially ringing in a new age for humankind, manifests itself at its most basic level as primarily economic imperialism. But the essential thing about this is that everything said about these matters, everything that is connected to this economic imperialism, is essentially untrue. It is in fact altogether false. It is full of hot air, shall we say. And in being full of hot air, it more or less consciously leads us toward non-truthfulness. But in order to see that in these times reality is altogether different than the things that are said about reality, it is necessary to peer deeply into the historical stream of these matters. To demonstrate the public's powers of discernment in regard to the facts of the contemporary world, I need only to point out to you one example. We all experienced the way in which Woodrow Wilson was glorified all over Europe and even in Germany itself. Our friends in Switzerland know well that during this period of glorifying Woodrow Wilson, I consistently spoke out against him. For it goes without saying that during the time when everyone was glorifying Woodrow Wilson, he was what he still is today. Already reports are coming in, and in saying this I do not mean to suggest that it is necessarily true, that people in America are now saying that Woodrow Wilson is unfit for the presidency, that they are questioning his ability to make good decisions. Public opinion, as it winds its way confusedly through the world these days, shows its true nature sufficiently in such instances as this. Such examples demonstrate its true worth. And let us not forget a second example of this. In the last 4 or 5 years, there has been an extraordinary amount of talk about any number of beautiful and wonderful ideas, self-determination for all people, and the like. These words were untrue, for all that lay behind them was of an entirely different nature. It all had to do with questions of power. And anyone who truly seeks an understanding must always return to the reality of what is said, thought, and judged. That people must pay particularly close attention when a word such as imperialism, Imperial Federation is the official word for it since the beginning of the 20th century in England, is used. In these words, we find the most recent derivatives of a long progression of evolution and development. And these words lead backward into distant and diverse times. Their meaning can be found only through a true study of history. We will not go as far back into history as one could go back through spiritual scientific study. but we will at least go back to several millennia before the Christian calendar. There we find first and foremost several imperialistic empires in Asia, and a slight variation on such imperialistic empires in Egypt. Very characteristic of the Eastern impulse is the Persian Empire, which is somewhat known to history, but particularly characteristic is the Assyrian Empire. Now, it would be wrong to identify the first phase of imperialism solely in the final periods described in our histories of the Assyrian Empire, because you simply cannot understand the dominant impulses of the Assyrian Empire unless you are able to go back to earlier conditions in the East. Even China, whose entire structure dates back to the far distant past, has changed enough that you cannot recognize in that structure, which existed until recently, the actual character of Eastern imperialism. We can, however, still peer through the relationships that are historically known and see what actually underlies them. Now, we will not understand the whole of the ancient Eastern imperialism if we are not familiar with the general understanding of the relationship between the people of a particular era, let us say a particular empire, and those whom we would now refer to as the rulers or the ruling class of that empire. It goes without saying that words we use such as ruler or king or something of the sort do not express what was felt about the rulers or the ruling class at that time. Only with great difficulty can we form a mental picture of the feeling world that existed in human beings 3 or 4 millennia before the beginning of the Christian calendar system, because it is so difficult for us to look back on the way in which human beings understood the relationship of the spiritual world to the physical world in that ancient time. Nowadays, when most people think about a spiritual world, if they think about the spiritual world at all, they imagine it in some distant netherworld. And if people talk about the spiritual world, we must all talk about the spiritual world again in the future as something that exists around us, just as the sensory world does. Then everything said has something of the quality of what, for example, led us to Protestant thinking. In ancient times, the essence of the matter is, namely, that no differentiation was made between the physical world and the spiritual world. This is so much the case that when we speak about things relating to those ancient times, we can barely form any sort of organized mental picture of it. So different was the mental and imaginative life of those ancient peoples from the mental and imaginative life of modern-day human beings. Everything that had a physical existence, rulers, the ruled, a ruling class, enslaved people, all of this was reality. It was not something that could be called physical reality, but rather it was the reality. It was simultaneously the physical and the spiritual reality. And the rulers of the Eastern empires, who or what were they then? The ruler of an Eastern empire was its god. And all across that empire, the people did not see a god somewhere above the clouds in those ancient times. I am always speaking of ancient times here. For these people, there was no choir of spiritual beings surrounding an almighty God. This is a perspective from a later period of human history. Rather, those whom we would call ministers or courtiers, whether out of disrespect or respect, were beings with a godly nature. Everyone clearly understood that by going through the mystery schools, these individuals had become something greater than normal human beings. People looked to them as Protestant individuals looked to their God, or as somewhat more liberal circles looked to their unseen angels or something of the sort. For unseen angels or an unseen God, existing in a super-sensory world above and beyond reality, simply did not exist for the peoples of the East. Everything that was spiritual lived within individuals. In normal human beings lived a human soul, in those we would call rulers, lived a divine soul, a God. We can no longer form any imagination or understanding of this mental picture of a true godly realm that exists simultaneously as a physical realm. That, let us say, the king truly possessed the power and dignity of a god is self-evidently absurd in this day and age, but it was once the reality during the time of Eastern imperialism. People simply did not speak about anything that could be understood as purely spiritual. A slight variation, as I said, was present in Egypt, for in that area we find a transition into a later period. If we go all the way back to the oldest forms of imperialism, we find that this imperialism stems from the fact that the king, the ruler, who is a god, a son of heaven with a true physical existence on the earth, is in fact the Father of heaven. This is so paradoxical for modern-day human beings that it hardly seems believable, but it is true. But this fact is intimately connected with what we can observe in Assyrian documents about the way in which imperialistic conquests were justified. Conquests were simply undertaken. The right to make such conquests was simply derived from the fact that one had always to expand the realm of one's God. If an area was conquered and the conquered people became the subjects of another realm, then they had to honor the conqueror as their God. People were not thinking about this as an expansion of a religious worldview. Why would they have needed to? After all, everything was actualized in the physical world. When the people of the conquered territory paid outward tribute to their conquerors, when they followed them, then everything was as it should be. They could believe what they wanted. Beliefs, which is to say one's personal opinions, were left altogether untouched in ancient times. People did not concern themselves with them. This was the first form in which imperialism appeared. The second form was one in which the ruling class, those who were to take on a dominant leading role, were not themselves gods, but rather sent by God or inspired by God and filled by the divine. In the first stage of imperialism, we are dealing with a reality. This is an essential fact. First phase of imperialism, we were dealing with reality. When such a ruler of the ancient East appeared among his people, he always wore his regalia, for he was entitled as a god to wear such clothing. Those were the clothes of a god. That was how a god was to look. This simply means that the way in which the ruler appeared was the style among the gods. And those who were his paladins were not simply clerks or simple functionaries, but were rather higher beings who surrounded him and did what they did by virtue of their existence as higher beings. Then came the time, as I said before, in which people saw rulers as those who were their paladins as sent by God. Let me read that again. Then came the time, as I said before, in which people saw rulers and those who were their paladins as sent by God, as individuals filled by the divine, as those commissioned by God. This was the prevailing idea, even at the time of Dionysius the Areopagite. Read his letters in which he describes the entire hierarchy of deacons, archdeacons, bishops and archbishops, the whole hierarchy of the church. How does he describe this hierarchy? Dionysius the Areopagite describes it as though in this earthly, churchly hierarchy one finds a reflection of what exists in the supersensory world with God and his elementary powers, archangels and angels. Thus there exists a heavenly hierarchy above, and beneath is its reflection, the earthly hierarchy. The members of the earthly hierarchy, the deacons and archdeacons, don their robes and carry out their rituals because these things are symbols. In the first phase of imperialism, we were dealing with reality. In the second phase, we are dealing with symbols. Naturally, this has all been more or less forgotten, For in the general consciousness of human beings nowadays, even among those who are Catholic, there is little awareness that the deacons, priests, deans, bishops, and archbishops are the representatives, the proxy agents of the heavenly hierarchies. But this fact has merely been lost to memory. With these steps forward, imperialism reached what I would like to call a point of division, a true fork in the road. On one side, that which held leadership and command tended more toward those sent by God, toward a priesthood in which the priests were kings. On the other side, there was a greater movement toward the earthly, but the position of ruler came always with the grace of God. It was always directed and commissioned by God. Fundamentally, these are simply two slight variations of the same thing, and we find both variations in the course of human history, in church society and in political society. During the first period of imperialism, when everything was present in physical reality, such a division would have been unthinkable. But in the second phase of imperialism, this separation occurred. There we find some individuals who tended more toward earthly leadership, though always as a ruler sent by God, as well as other individuals also sent by God who tended toward leadership in the church. This lasted well into the Middle Ages, and I would like to point out that the life of the God-sent kings and priests in a physical empire, in the outer reality, lasted up to the year 1806 in one characteristic historical phenomenon. Of course, the Roman Church continued to exist and spread in the physical world after that point. That existence was more on the side of the priestly. But the thing that really held the Middle Ages together, the thing that strictly maintained the principle of the God-sent ruler here on the physical earth, was the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation, which, as I mentioned, came to an end only in 1806. This was the name of what existed in Central Europe as a sort of empire, the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation. In the word holy, you find a trace of the godly element that existed on the earth in ancient times. Quotes Roman points back to the empire's origins. German nation indicates the thing over which this empire was laying, the more earthly element upon which it was imposed. And so in the second phase of imperialism, we no longer find the anointed imperialism of the Church. Instead, we have the intermingling of both godly and earthly anointed individuals within the empire. This began back in the old Roman Empire in pre-Christian times and lasted into the later years of the Middle Ages. The new imperialism that developed possessed a double nature. The Holy Roman Empire of the German nation. Period. Think about it for a moment. It all goes back to Charlemagne. Charlemagne was crowned by the Pope in Rome. Thereby, the position of the king was publicly made into a symbol, and consequently that which exists here on the physical earth is not all of reality. The people of the Middle Ages did not honor Charlemagne or Otto I as gods, as the people in ancient times would have done, but they saw them as individuals sent by God. And that idea had to be constantly reinforced. Over time, it naturally weakened in human consciousness. But when it was made somehow visible, then as a symbolic act it took on a reality as a symbol at the very least. The emperors of the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation went to Rome so that they could be crowned by the Pope. István I, the Hungarian, also went to Rome from Hungary in the year 1000 CE to be made king by the Pope. The spiritual powers imparted a blessing upon the individuals who ruled in the physical world, and thereby awarded them power. But this led to the entrance of something new into human consciousness, causing them to believe that they had the authority and right to incorporate all others into this empire, whose leader had been anointed by God. Dante himself was of the opinion that the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation was fundamentally entitled to rule the entire world. In this opinion of Dante's we find the formulation of imperialism. In the legends and lore that have crystallized in human consciousness throughout the course of our history, things are expressed that as a general rule can be considered from a wide variety of perspectives and do not have just one interpretation. We could say, in the 11th and 12th centuries, there must still have been a strong awareness in Europe, even if it were a bit unclear, more of a feeling awareness, but one that was felt very strongly, that back in ancient times, over in the East, there had been people on earth, people who lived a physical existence on earth, who had actually been gods. This was simply not a superstition. Oh no, on the contrary, people thought, nowadays such gods cannot live on the earth anymore, because the earth has become so evil. That thing which once made human beings into gods has been lost. The Holy Grail has been lost, and now in the Middle Ages you can only teach it in the way that Parzival did. You seek the path to finding the God within, whereas once God had a physical reality within an empire. Now that empire is just a collection of symbols and signs, and one must find God in those symbols, in those signs. From all these things that ever existed, vestiges remain. Reality becomes diluted. Vestiges remain in a wide variety of forms. As a general rule, when something, for as long as it has a reality in the world, is clear and singular, it becomes ambiguous and multifaceted as time passes. And consequently, a wide variety of things in Europe have sprung up from the clarity and singularity of old. For as long as the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation held any meaning for human consciousness, the leader of that Holy Roman Empire of the German nation was powerful, able to tame the individual angel symbols that were the princes of the various territories. For people still had it in their consciousness that it was his right to do this. But his right was based more or less in something ideal. Over time, that gradually lost its meaning. As a result, this left the princes of the territories on their own. And, speaking generally, in the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation, we have something that gradually pushed out its true inner substance, leaving only the external shell. That earthly human beings were sent by God to be leaders was gradually lost to consciousness. And the expression of that fact, that people were no longer able to think of earthly human beings as sent by God, is Protestantism. Protestantism is the protest against the true meaning of the individual, quote, sent by God, close quote. If the principle of Protestantism were truly to penetrate into our consciousness, then no crowned head or knighted individual could ever say that this was by the grace of God. But these things remain as vestiges of the past. These vestiges remained in the world through 1918, and then they disappeared. These vestiges, which had lost all of their inner meaning, still remained as outward phenomena in the world. These German territorial princes were still there as outward phenomena, but they only had any true meaning back in older times, when they were symbols of an inspirited heavenly empire. There are still other vestiges of the past that exist in the world, in a way that makes it difficult to know from which period they are a carryover. It was not so long ago that a Central European bishop, or perhaps it might have been an archbishop, published a pastoral letter in which he basically proclaimed that a Catholic priest is more powerful than Jesus Christ, as proven by the simple fact that when a Catholic priest carries out the ritual of transubstantiation at the altar, Jesus Christ is obligated to be present in the host. The ritual of transubstantiation can only be completed through the powers of the priest. In other words, the action that the priest carries out compels the Christ Jesus to be present at the altar. Thus, the more powerful being is not the Christ Jesus, but rather the one who carries out the ritual of transubstantiation at the altar. When we want to understand such a thing, which, as I mentioned, was published only a few years ago in a pastoral letter, we must look back not to the second phase of imperialism, but rather to the first phase of imperialism, and how completely the Catholic Church and its subsidiaries preserved many aspects of this first phase of imperialism. In that we find a vestige of the consciousness that those who rule on the earth are gods, whereas Jesus Christ is only the Son of God. The content of this pastoral letter is, for someone with a Protestant consciousness, as impossible to believe as the idea that thousands of years ago people saw their rulers as gods is for a person nowadays to believe. But actually, all of these things are historical facts, are truths that in the historical being, in historical reality, have played a role. The vestiges of these truths are still present in the world to this day. And so it is that early realities play into the later phenomena of the world. This is not to say that the worldviews remain the same, but the practices that emerge from these worldviews do remain the same. Take a look at the way in which the teachings of Muhammad have spread across the world. Muhammad himself certainly never said, "Muhammad is your God," as a priest leader of the ancient world might have said several thousand years earlier. He limited himself to a declaration that was already more fitting to his time period, saying, "There is a God, and Muhammad is his prophet." Thus, in human consciousness, he took on the position of a God-sent individual, the second phase of imperialism. In terms of the manner in which Muhammad's thought and teachings spread across the world, however, the first phase of imperialism is more fitting. The Muslims were never intolerant of people who held other beliefs, so long as they paid tribute to the God of Muhammad. The Muslims were content to conquer others and make them their subjects, just as it was done in ancient times, where there was also little concern for a person's beliefs. For in the end, it made no difference what a person believed, as long as he simply recognized the power of the ruling God. The manner in which the Muslims spread across the world is a practice dating back to the first phase of imperialism. And in Russian despotism, in the Tsars of Russia, something also remained from the first phase of imperialism, strongly colored by its movement through the second phase. In the whole way in which the people of Russia think of the Tsar, or at the very least in the mood that exists in their feeling core, there is something that can be traced back to the first phase of imperialism. As a result, there has been so little interest in bringing together what actually exists in the consciousness of the Russian people with the things that stream out from the Tsars. For actually the Tsar's position of rule in Russia is based on German and Mongolian elements, and not actually the elements of the Russian peasants. Thus the vestiges of earlier times continue to exist in the present. Even in the recent historical periods, we can find these vestiges of the past. This brings us to the third phase of imperialism. Though it has been fully formed only since the beginning of the 20th century, when Chamberlain and his people came up with the concept of the Imperial Federation, its origins lie farther into the past, sometime in the second half of the 17th century. At that time, there was that great revolution in England, which for all of the Anglo-American peoples living in Western territories effectively turned the personage of the king, who had once been a god, and then had been God-sent, into a mere shadow, a mere, we cannot say decoration, but into a position merely tolerated. After the 17th century, the laws and acts of a population came out of what was desired by the people. Of course, this was at first divided along class lines. Then the Anglo-American peoples brought different prior experiences and preconditions to this, shall we say, will of the people idea, this system of popular voting. Then did others, such as the French, the descendants of the Romans, the Latins. The Latin peoples, particularly the French, underwent a revolution of their own in the 18th century. But due to the influence of things that I described to you here not long ago, the French as a people are actually more kingly than any other people of the world. You do not need to have a king as your leader in order to be kingly. To be sure, a person cannot continue to act as the ruler of a people after his head has been chopped off, but the French people are kingly, imperialistic, without having a king at the helm. It has to do with the condition of the French soul. This collective feeling of oneness as a people, this collective folk consciousness, is actually a very real vestige of the consciousness at the time of Louis XIV. But the English-speaking peoples brought other preconditions and prior experiences to the idea we can call the, quote, will of the people, close quote. And gradually, out of the assessments that effectively became public opinion, out of the things that streamed out into society from the elected officials in Parliament, the third form of imperialism emerged and developed, formulated first by individuals such as Chamberlain and others like him. But we will try to consider it on the soul level today, this third form of imperialism. The first imperialism had reality. A person was a god in the consciousness of the other people. His paladins were gods surrounding him, lesser gods. Second imperialism, all things on the earth are symbols and signs. God was simply at work within individuals. Third form of imperialism, everything on earth that originates and streams outward from the human soul is divested of its status as a symbol or sign. Just as we moved from realities to symbols and signs, so do we now move from symbols and signs to phrases. This is said without any stirrings of feeling. He has a Latin phrase here, sine ira, I-R-A. It is a purely objective description of a fact resulting from the necessary process of earthly becoming. Since the 17th century, it is truly the case that everything occurring in the public life of the Anglo-American peoples, everything spoken or written in books of law is the, quote, will of the people, close quote, divided along class lines, of course. Perhaps tomorrow or the next day we will come to a description of this will of the people, but it is a phrase. The relationship that exists between what is spoken and reality is not the same as the one between a symbol and reality. This is the course things follow in the human soul. It moves in this progression from reality to symbol and then to phrase, to dried out empty words. And what results from out of these dried out and empty words becomes the principal reality of the time. No person would ever imagine that the resulting reality was once godly in its origin. For let us think for a moment about the foundation of that imperialism whose dominant element is the phrase. In the first imperialism, the king; in the second imperialism, the anointed; in the third imperialism, the phrase. It goes without saying that nothing real will ever result from the principle of majority rules. Only dominant phrases will come of it. And these realities drift about below and are consequently never perceived to be somehow godly or divine. Let us take a look at one of the important foundations for the things that occur as reality: colonization. Colonization plays a major role in the development of the third imperialism. For the whole colonial system, the spread of the empire into the colonies, The Imperial Federation is the final form, the means of centralizing this effort. But how did these colonies originally take form as limbs of the empire? Think about what actually occurred. Adventurers, individuals for whom no one had any real use within the empire, people who were a little rough around the edges, moved out into the colonies, got rich, and then went home and spent all of their money. This, however, did not do anything to turn them into distinguished people, so they continued to be adventurers, bohemians. And thus the colonial empire was brought together. This is the reality that existed under the influence of the phrase. But vestiges of the past remain, just as symbols and phrases, or territorial princes and czars remained from the original realities of the world. Realities continue to exist from the adventurous undertakings of the somewhat notorious, odious colonists, realities that we now find ourselves left with. Is it not the case that at some point these adventurers were, shall we say, adopted? Their sons, well, they were perhaps not quite so notorious and odious. They smelled a little better than their fathers. Their grandsons smelled much better than their grandfathers. And then you see, then comes a time where everything smells lovely. In this case, the phrase usurps something, and already the odious act begins to smell altogether good. The state stretches broad its wings and becomes the protector, and suddenly everything is above board. It is necessary, however, that we grasp the true point of these things. It is perhaps impossible to call them by their true name, for the names we use seldom give an indication of the reality of the things. It is necessary because only by doing that can we begin to understand the tasks given to us by this time and the responsibility that this time has placed before us. Only by doing that can we come to see that so-called history, meaning the history taught and studied in schools and universities, is a fable convenue. This history does not call the things by their true names. On the contrary, it has the effect of gradually attaching these names to untruths. It is a terrible thing, is it not, what I have just described? But you see, now it is the time to channel this sense, this feeling of responsibility, even if only a little bit. Let us consider now the other side of this matter. Let us look back for a moment at an ancient empire. It was all real on earth in human perception. The priest-kings arose from the mystery schools. The second was no longer on earth. Rather, the second was symbolic. There is a wide gap separating the ancient rulers and the paladins who hung upon them like godly jewels, and the red or black eagles denoting the third, fourth, or first rank that were then hung upon individuals. But nevertheless, this is the path of history. Things went from reality to nothingness, and finally they became no longer a symbol, but fundamentally nothing more than the expression of a phrase. Is it not the case that now the superficiality of the general phrase system that spread from the West out into the rest of the world has penetrated even into public affairs? I have even heard now of, quote, titular heads of state, close quote. Now the rulers and advisers had unusually little to rule or advise anyway, or in some cases knew little about how to rule or advise, but titular heads of state? And still, everything can be traced back to that old practice of which I spoke. In the first phase I talked about, everything that existed in the physical world, everything that was real on earth, was also thought to be altogether spiritual. In the second phase, it was thought to be simply filled with spiritual substance. And the third phase must grow beyond its current form, which I have just described to you. It must grow beyond the empire of the phrase and all the realities associated with it that we have just talked about. The third phase must bring into reality the spiritual empire here on earth. Whereas in the first phase, physical reality was thought to be spiritual, we may not allow ourselves to think of physical reality as spiritual only in the future, but therefore spiritual reality must be present here in the physical world. In other words, spiritual reality must live and exist beside physical reality. We must all move about and through the physical world while simultaneously recognizing a spiritual reality and being able to speak about a truly extant, supersensory world that, though invisible, is nevertheless there and must be supported by us. I spoke before of something very negative, the phrase. But if the outer world had not moved so completely into empty phrases, there would be no space into which the spiritual empire could enter. It is because everything old has now become nothing more than an empty phrase that an empty space now exists for the spiritual empire to fill. Especially in the West, in the Anglo-American world, everything is managed in such a way that a lot of people continue to speak in, shall we say, old familiar idioms about any number of things that come from days of old. As I have said, this will continue to roll along like a ball rolling down a hill. In people's words, this will continue to roll along. You can find countless sayings and phrases in the West that have lost all meaning, but continue to be regularly used. But the actual idea of a phrase containing no reality, a phrase out of which all true reality has already been squeezed, that lives not only in these old sayings and phrases, but actually in everything identified by old words. In those empty phrases is the space wherein the spiritual, or something that is not in accord with any of the things of old, can take hold. It was necessary for the old to become nothing more than a phrase. We must throw out everything old that continues to fester within our language, and bring in something altogether new, which can stream out toward us only from the spiritual world. Only then can a Christ empire come to be on the earth, for the following must be accepted as a reality in that empire. My kingdom is not of this world. In the empire of this world in which the Christ empire first appeared, there was still much that existed in this world that had not yet become an empty phrase. But everything that came from an older time in the Western world was foreordained to become an empty phrase. Yes, in the West, in the Anglo-American world, all human traditions and practices will become empty phrases. Consequently, the responsibility lies there to place a spirit in the empty receptacle left behind, a spirit of whom it can be said, "His kingdom is not of this world." This is the great responsibility of our time. It is not about the form into which things have developed. What is important is what we do now that they have so developed, and thus these things become part of a continuity. Our discussion tomorrow might further actualize this continuity. We will talk about the secret societies that are active beneath the surface in the Western world. These societies traditionally move from the second phase of imperialism toward the third, for in the Anglo-American peoples we find two different imperialisms intermingled with one another, the economic imperialism of Chamberlain and the symbolic imperialism of the secret societies, which are very actively and effectively integrated, but necessarily kept secret from the population at large. Part 2. I have been speaking to you about the historical origins of what we can nowadays call imperialism, and you will already have noted from what I said yesterday that these considerations of imperialism are dependent upon being able to recognize that phenomena of the present, which were at one time real elements of life, are in reality nothing more than vestiges of an older time. In that older time, these practices, rituals, and institutions all had their own genuine meaning. They were, by and large, realities. That reality was lost over time. They developed through a period of existence as symbols, and finally became nothing more than empty phrases. We are living now entirely in the age of the empty phrase. We need simply to come to see that the empty phrases of the present are necessarily rooted in a past out of which they have grown, and that, on the other hand, these empty phrases are a preparatory stage for what must enter now into human evolution. If reality had not transformed into phrases, meaning into something that is essentially an extant illusion, it would not be possible for something altogether new to come into being. New things could not come into the world if, for example, the visible, perceptible gods in human form still towered over the human race, as was the case during the Roman Empire, when the last descendants of these gods lived. For the Roman emperors were, even if it was not felt as fully as it had once been during more ancient times, they were, nonetheless, gods in their pretensions. Nero was a god in human form, at least if we follow the assumptions and hypotheses made about him. Over the course of time, these things lost their true meaning. They traveled through the age of symbols and allegories, and then became nothing more than phrases. Now it is the case that the more completely these things transform into empty phrases, the more the ground is prepared for the entrance into a new reality, a spiritual life that is not taken out of the sensory world, but rather the supersensory world, a spiritual life that does not find godly spiritual beings in the forms of human beings, but rather finds true and genuine spiritual beings existing in and among the visible physical human beings on the earth. The empire of the empty phrase must exist first, and must then also be recognized for what it is. Then it will be possible for a new spiritual life to develop. If you want to understand the present based on such, shall we say, uncomfortable premises, then you must be able to gaze upon the birth of a new spiritual life occurring alongside the dissolution into illusion of everything that once had reality in human evolution. It is all too natural that we desire to cling to the old realities, even after they have become nothing more than empty phrases. For to see clearly that things have become these empty phrases engenders an uncertainty in our feeling core. When we are forced to admit that these old things have become mere phrases, we believe that we no longer have a secure floor beneath our feet. People love to delude themselves because they believe that in the moment they accept that the delusion is a delusion, they will suddenly drift up into the air. But you would no longer believe that you will drift off aimlessly like this if you were able to feel truly the solidity of the new spiritual life. We are living currently in an age in which we must be a participant both in the life of the dying phrase and in the burgeoning spiritual life. This will be made possible especially by the continuing emergence of the English-speaking peoples of the world, and the things which they have traditionally maintained since an earlier time, and about which they still speak, the way in which those things have necessarily become empty phrases, and the way in which economic life continues to exist in a reality amidst those phrases, just as I described to you yesterday. Economic life is the only thing that can be truly real in a world of empty phrases. But a time will come, a moment of particular importance. In the moment when we feel that we are dealing only with that economic life, which in the third and fourth generation will of course become, in quotes, fair and square, as I described to you yesterday, and otherwise with nothing more than phrases, in this moment we will have a feeling of the nothingness of humankind, the base existence within a physical life that composes the whole of reality. This knowledge must be born in the peoples of the Western world especially. The moment must come in which this conviction takes hold in our souls. We can no longer grab hold of anything about which we speak. The only reality that surrounds us is the acquisition and preparation of things for our stomachs and digestion. As long as we do not see that the empty phrases in the world are phrases, as long as we do not know that economics is the only true reality in the world, we will not arrive at the necessary understanding. When we do arrive at the necessary understanding, however, then human nature can do nothing other than say to itself, in order to be a human being, we must bring a spiritual reality to this physical reality consisting solely of economic life. The dawning moment of this knowledge must come soon. Without it, human evolution can go no farther. For the same reason that we are moving in the direction of a new spiritual life, we must also immerse ourselves at present in the element of the empty phrase. Now, the strongest gift, the greatest talent for this knowledge, exists in the people of the West. In the West, the right preconditions exist for a dawning of this knowledge, whereas the rest of the peoples of Europe, for example, are in less of a position to have such knowledge dawn for them with the necessary intensity. For in those regions, other relationships dominate, which hinder the possibility of seeing through the illusions as fundamentally or radically as can occur in the West. You need only to turn your gaze again toward the historical relationships to understand this. Think for a moment about the fact that the various populations of German origin have been united since the time of the descendants of Charlemagne, since the Saxon and Staufen leaders of the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation, as I said yesterday. This Holy Roman Empire of the German nation was essentially an entire network of various symbols. Everything within it had the character of signs and symbols. In everything that you came across, it was necessary to trace back the signs and symbols until you found some form of reality. But this penetration of the signs and symbols did not lead to a fully spiritual reality. The Church prevented this from occurring. By and large, you would arrive at some nebulous place, drifting about in a spiritual reality. Consequently, everything that the Middle Ages and the descendants of the European church communities had to say about such a spiritual reality had the quality of something only half-grasped, something not completely understood. It had the quality of a light shining through the colored panes of glass in a medieval church. People shrank away from the spiritual world when they arrived at it through the symbols and signs of the Middle Ages. They shrank back from a clear, direct understanding. On the contrary, people preferred to describe the matter such that it continued to exist as something half unknown that could not be penetrated by knowledge. And the same was actually true in the case of outward social relationships. Anyone who studies with an inner sense the history of the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation, and the history of Switzerland is also inwardly connected with this history of the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation, you will see that one nonsensical thing was always built upon the last nonsensical thing from one age to the next. People tried to use these nonsensical things to take up the matter of societal organization, seeking to live within it and understand it on the basis of these things, possessing no clarity. Until in 1806, people finally noticed, even the Habsburgs noticed it at the time, that the whole Holy Roman Empire of the German nation no longer made any sense. And the especially gifted, and by that I mean gifted in a negative sense, Emperor Franz I resigned the German imperial crown after completing a personal, or as they call it in this case, in-house switch of the Austrian crown not 2 years before. The whole thing lost any possibility of continuing to exist, because in the end, people could no longer find any meaning behind these symbols. And for the people of Central Europe, nothing was left except for a sense of striving, a desire that reached out toward all possible things, but contained within it little sense or meaning. This resulted in the founding of the empire in 1870-71, complete with its own inner contradiction. A German emperor was named, but the position did not result from any relationships that existed in reality. The title was simply invented. In France, if something similar had occurred, an emperor reinstated, then the people might perhaps have understood, at least partially, because they still had within them some actual substance for such a thing. But within the being of the German people, there was just a name, which might have proven that they had some talent for creating names that had no meaning, that they had some talent for acting in service of the empty phrase, on the one hand, and of the neighboring reality of an economic life that otherwise had nothing to do with phrases, on the other. But there was no such talent in Central Europe. In order to understand what came about in Central Europe, we must be clear about the fact that history should not be studied through abstract concepts, but rather through realities. We can throw out a question and aim at reality. What is it actually that came into being in the German Empire between 1871 and 1914? Everything that existed there, everything that people saw around them was only an illusion. What was the reality? Well, you see, when it comes to historical phenomena, it is the case that something occurs, but something altogether different is contained below the surface. When the first phenomena, the illusion, disappears, then the second will appear on its heels in reality. We should not try to analyze this, but rather we must look to the reality, the concrete things. What developed in the German Empire between 1871 and 1914 does not manifest during this time period, for everything happening then was all illusion. The reality follows on its heels. The reality is everything that has occurred since November of 1918. This is what truly holds power at present. The archetypal character of the Wilhelmine period is Noska. The true nature of everything that has been developing for decades only emerged when the current individuals in power took their posts. The ex-emperor of the German Empire is defined by the so-called revolutionary figures in power at present. The conditions that lay beneath the surface decades ago, during a time when people abandoned themselves to the illusions that existed, those are the conditions that now exist in reality. And in this way we can truly study history, insofar as we seek the involution within the evolution, insofar as we seek to discover what is developing beneath the surface. What then is the true nature of 18th century Tsarism? The former Russian Tsarism, when its reality truly appears, now takes the form of Lenin and Trotsky, Bolshevism. This is the concrete reality of what was once mere illusion. Tsarism was simply the lie that swam over the surface. The truth of Tsarism appeared as soon as it had faded away. Lenin is nothing else if not a former Tsar. Once you strip away his surface layer, you are left only with his true reality. And in this case, that reality is named Lenin or Trotsky. Or, continuing with this same idea, if you strip away the surface layer from people like Caprivi or Hohenlohe or Bettmann Hollweg, you are left with Noska, Scheidemann, and others like them. These are the true figures, and the others were simply illusions superimposed upon them. Reader aside, there are a number of names here, and there are footnotes. I am not reading them. End of footnote. End of aside. What is important is that we not illustrate an historical phenomena using abstract concepts and ideas, but that we instead use those things that really were there in history. The definition of one thing in history will always be another fact or event, and never an abstract concept. This is what it means to truly study reality. And it follows from this that we must always be careful to direct our gaze onto the true realities of any situation. For nowadays we live in an age in which many realities must be seen through, in which realities must be constantly laid bare by stripping away the outer layer. This phenomenon can be seen, especially when you study the makeup, the content of those secret societies that have a particularly strong influence within the English-speaking people, an influence that goes unsuspected by the public. These are societies that work together under particular sympathetic outward rules, societies that in the fifth post-Atlantean epoch have achieved an ever-increasing influence in the world. If you look back to the year 1720, you will find that in England there were a few members in such societies. These members were simply the implements, by and large, with those who had actual influence standing somewhere behind them. But back then, there were also only a few people who were members of these societies. If we look at the statistics nowadays, we find that in the Society of Freemasons, the kind of society which is a useful implement in the hands of the secret societies, there are 488 lodges in London, 1,354 lodges in all of Great Britain, 486 English-speaking lodges in the colonies and abroad. And associated with those, we also have the so-called Royal Arch Masons, who hold the outward practices of Freemasonry a bit more secretly than the others. There are 836 lodges of that society in the world. Now, it is important, first of all, to cast our gaze on the fact that the substantial content of what exists in these lodges is an implement for these individuals who are truly empowered behind the scenes. And then it is a matter of finding the reasons why these powers have continued to have an unusually large significance to this day. The actual substantial content goes back to the distant past. And those who are always insisting that the content of Freemasonry dates back to the distant past are not altogether wrong, even if their descriptions of the things are often nebulous or perhaps even intentionally false. But looking back toward the distant past touches upon a background that is certainly true. Indeed, it goes so far back into the past that we can accurately say the time out of which these things come is that of the first ancient phase of imperialism, when gods walked among us in human form. At that time, everything that was said in these lodges, and particularly everything that they practiced, made sense. Then it all became symbols. The true sense of these things has been there for ages. We can accurately say that within the lodges that exist currently, there is barely any awareness or content in the things that are said and done. But the symbols remained. The symbols have propagated themselves within the realm of the empty phrase. Consequently, in English-speaking areas, and those areas connected with them, we have two layers of cultural ferment existing beside one another. The altogether exoteric outward phrase that dominates public life, and the symbols protected purely out of a sense of tradition within the secret societies. No one makes any effort to trace them back to their true origins, but they are protected and maintained as symbols. And so the symbol becomes a phrase in the form of a symbol, or a symbol that has undergone the development into a phrase, but appeared in the world in a different form. Thus, we have the outward exoteric phrases of public life, which find expression in everyday human speech and carry on an existence in the Parliament, for example. And then we also have, in secret societies, the ongoing existence of symbols that are, by and large, not understood by those who have inherited these symbols. They are things with the quality of an empty phrase, but the form of a symbol. This is an important fact, that next to the purely verbal phrase of external life, we also have the cultural phrase, the ceremonial phrase. for these ceremonial phrases always hide a spiritual element within. And in secret societies which have genuine ceremonial forms, meaning ones that date back to genuine practices of old, it can happen that individuals who are particularly gifted due to their karma can arrive at an understanding of the true meaning of these symbols. After all, sometimes even a blind chicken can find a kernel of corn. So it can sometimes happen that especially gifted individuals can arrive at the meaning behind these ceremonies. Afterward, they are removed from the secret society. This prevents them from causing any more harm to that secret society. For the thing that is important for these societies is not insight and understanding. It is power. Therefore, it is only about maintaining and protecting the secret rituals in their traditional form. And in practicing these traditional forms, they have a certain power. Why? I have already spoken of the character of the content of these traditional forms, but this content is, of course, connected to the people who band together in these secret societies. Think about how many people belong to the various lodges of these societies around the world. But they were won over to the idea of joining these lodges by certain factors. And one of the most important factors that originally won these people over to the lodges, even though this particular factor is transgressed against in a variety of ways by nearly all of the lodges, especially nowadays, though this does not dissipate their effectiveness, one of the most important perspectives under which people have bound together in these lodges is the fact that religious beliefs were not discussed or questioned. Certainly these days this principle has been violated. There are lodges of Freemasons in the world who, for example, will not allow any Jews to join. It goes without saying that such lodges exist, but these lodges do not understand the foundational principle. The foundational principle is to take in people of all religions. This is one of the main foundational principles, to pay no heed to the content of an individual's beliefs. The other is to pay no attention to a person's class or other differences in the world outside of the lodge. People who are members of a true lodge are all brothers, regardless of whether they are lords or working-class citizens. But this principle has also been violated. Most lodges will not accept any working-class citizens, and will only take in lords and others who are amenable to them. But this has nothing to do with the foundational principles as such. Everyone within a lodge is nevertheless united under the slogan, "All are brothers." There are ranks within the society, but these have nothing to do with the class divisions, the social divisions in human interaction outside of the lodge. Thus, the members of the lodge are united under principles that have nothing to do with the outside world, nothing to do with our external society. For in our external society we have divided people first and foremost according to their religious beliefs, which play a large role there. Religious beliefs do not play any role in a true lodge. And furthermore, no one could claim that people in external society are all brothers. In the lodges, those who are members at least are brothers. But such things have real significance. The principles under which a group of people are brought together is not inconsequential. When a group of people are brought together under a unified religious belief, then in actual life the society is, in its principles, only built upon external power, upon a form of power that is now dead. When a group of people is united by the perspective that a person's religious beliefs make no difference, then a society will result that possesses a strong spiritual power. This is the reason the Catholic Church always had to support its power through political means, because they wanted to unite people under a certain more or less unified religious belief. The Church grew more powerful the less people depended upon religious beliefs, the less the hierarchy of the Church, the less Rome itself depended upon religious beliefs. For in external life, in the social order of the physical world, to hold religious convictions in the position of authority within a society was to render that society powerless. A society can only step forward as a powerful presence when it pays no attention to religious beliefs. This is of particular importance in this age of the empty phrase. For next to the external phrase stands the esoteric phrase, the phrase of the ceremony, the phrase of the cult. And actually out of this backdrop, the social confusion of the present arose in our reality. We can cite some very peculiar evidence of the phrase-like quality of this age. You all know that until the middle of the 19th century, there were two opposing parties in the English Parliament: the Liberal Party, the Whigs, and the Conservative Party, the Tories. Whigs and Tories were opposed to one another. But what kind of names were these actually? In the first half of the 19th century, people took them very seriously. You referred to a Liberal as a Whig and did not need to feel embarrassed about it. You referred to the others as Tories and did not need to feel embarrassed about that either. But when these names first arrived on the scene, during the early days of the English Parliament, what were those two names at that time? The term Whig had formerly been an insult. It came to Parliament as an insult, as an alliance formed in Scotland against the particularly stringent English regulations that had been instated there. A group of Scottish individuals banded together and were then referred to insultingly as Whigs in England. So you see, a phrase traveled so far as to go from being an insult to an official name for a political party. Think about how this all played out in reality. The reality is that the members of this Scottish alliance were referred to as Whigs in England. Then it was the highly honourable Liberals who were not insulted, but rather defined by the term Whig. And the Tories, that was a name that came from Ireland. It was the term used to refer to followers of the Popery. Then this name, which had been an insulting name for members of the Irish Popery, became the official name for English conservatives. All of this played itself out in the realm of names, the domain of terms, the empire of phrases. True reality has nothing to do with any of it. This is an example that, shall we say, is taken from the surface layer. For you could find other examples exactly like this one, first and foremost in the English-speaking world, but also in the rest of the world, insofar as it was and is afflicted by the empty phrase. But why is it then that so many people band together under principles that are absolutely admirable, such as those who come together in the lodges? It does not really matter that some small amount of truly dubious existence is also present in these lodges. What matters is the underlying principle. It is extremely significant that people come together under very powerful perspectives, and that they come together in ceremonial phrases, in a phrase-like cult, which then, for its part, gives the group cohesion out of a true spiritual basis. Of course, it is also the case that when someone is, let us say, a powerful minister and needs an undersecretary, it goes without saying that he would prefer to appoint his Freemason rather than to appoint just anyone off the street. This preference is even justifiable, for he knows his brother better and can work with him more effectively. A mob can be established by the same justifiable means, which is never negative for the relationships that it builds, but which must, nevertheless, cease to work in this manner in the world. But what is it then that will take its place? It is noteworthy that precisely in this age, in which empty phrases are dominant in public life, that in this age of the empty phrase, a spiritual stream has entered the world, a spiritual society with decidedly effective principles. This spiritual society has been very secretive, not so much about its existence, but about the actual inner impulse that drives it. Why is that exactly? Because we live in the age of the empty phrase, and the phrase has allowed realities to be falsified. For what is it that is actually taking form? What already more or less exists? First, there is the independent economic life, which is no longer in accord with the empty phrase. The spiritual life, which has been pushed underground, and the rights life, which paces the world as a phrase in a toga with more or less the same meaning for the physical world as jurisprudence and the English judges who sit on the bench in their legal regalia. The relationship between this legal regalia and the reality that exists in the world is the same as the relationship between jurisprudence and the underlying reality of the world. A threefold structure in the empire of the empty phrase, a threefold structure in falsehood, but proof for the necessity of the threefold social order. You see, to instate the threefold social order is, in essence, to replace lies and empty phrases with truth, but specifically with truth as reality, whereas currently we are living in an age in which reality is not truth but rather empty phrases, and everything connected with them. It is just as possible to carry on with empty phrases in the spiritual life as it is in the rights or political life. Only in the economic life is this not possible, for in that case we must take into consideration some larger issues that people continue to argue against in many of my public lectures. The same arguments come up again and again. After I have described the way in which a human being moves through the world, that I spoke of in my book titled How to Know Higher Worlds, and arrive at the idea of developing an inner sight into the spiritual world, into spiritual reality, then someone at every third lecture stands up during the discussion and says, yes, but how can a person know that what he is seeing inwardly is reality? There is such a thing as autosuggestion, after all. This entire spiritual world can simply be a product of autosuggestion. There is even the suggestion that when a person just thinks of lemonade, he can taste the lemonade in his mouth. The person suggests the taste of lemonade to himself. There is no actual taste of lemonade there, but a person has simply to think of it, and then can taste it in his mouth. In response to this, I always say, it all depends upon standing fully in reality. It is certainly true that a person can suggest to himself the taste of lemonade, but he cannot quench his thirst by suggesting it to himself in his thoughts. The quenching of thirst is missing. So if you step far enough away from it, you are easily led back to reality. We can have phrases in the realm of the spirit. We can even have empty phrases in the realm of politics and state affairs. But we cannot easily have phrases in the realm of economic life because we cannot eat them, or at the very least cannot be made full by them. And consequently, in the age of the empty phrase, economic reality is left in the most characteristic position of all realities. And in the moment, I have to say this again, in which we recognize that the illusion is an illusion, that an empty phrase is an empty phrase, a tremendous feeling of shame will emerge. Despite the fact that we human beings possess reason, we do nothing with this reason except tend to the basic economic needs of physical life, though even animals manage to tend to their own physical needs without possessing reason. When we human beings do nothing else with our reason except tend to the basic economic concerns of life, such as providing food for ourselves and getting the other basic things essential to physical life, then we are prostituting out our reason. We are using our reason to provide something that animals are perfectly capable of providing for themselves without the luxury of reason. In the moment this self-awareness dawns upon us, the moment that when we recognize the empty phrase as an empty phrase, in this moment a great feeling of shame will emerge, followed by the turnabout. Then will emerge an insight into the necessity for a renewal of the spiritual world. This must, however, be prepared for adequately, and that will occur only when a sufficiently large number of people are able to see through the relationships existing at present. For what good does it do when people fool themselves about what is real at the moment? What good does it do to believe in Lloyd George when you can see that everything that comes out of his mouth is nothing more than an empty phrase? What good does it do that the whole world bows down before Woodrow Wilson, even though you can clearly see that his politics are nothing but empty phrases? What good does it do to think about European relations on the basis of principles that have been inbred and inherited from a time centuries ago, principles that can have no power in the relationships of the contemporary world? We should also see symbols in the phenomena of history. We should be clear about the fact that already in the phenomena of the external world, peculiar and noteworthy things are happening. The Habsburgs, they have left Alsace, moving through Switzerland toward the east, ever onward toward the east. They arrived at their easternmost point when they became apostolic kings of Hungary. But in this journey from west to east lies the singular fact that Western realities are fading and disappearing into the east. The House of Hohenzollern did not go nearly as far, just from Nuremberg to Berlin, but also traveled from west to east. This historical sign is indeed a real symbol that we would do well to pay attention to. And we must also cast our gaze upon what is truly reality among all the empty phrases. For that reason, it is impossible for anyone to gain an understanding of reality from the things that live in public opinion. Anyone nowadays who has any sense of actuality will arrive at very strange conclusions trying to analyze those things that appear in public life, all of the reproductions and emulations found throughout the world, such as the Whigs and the Tories. One eventually finds their origins. They once were terms of insult, and then people found it necessary to take them seriously, because it was not easy to find any good serious names for the realities that existed in the world. This is how it goes with a lot of things these days. With an incredible number of things, this is how it goes. In public life nowadays, we try to enshroud words in a very particular kind of mystical darkness, and we do not notice. We do not notice that we are living in the age of empty phrases. For example, I know of one very interesting codex full of boldly composed phrases. When you open up this codex, you find sentences of a very peculiar nature, sentences like, "What is the law? The law is the will of the people." And it goes on from there. Yes, my dear friends, the law is the will of the people. People, for human beings nowadays, this is nothing more than a collection of individuals. But this collection is supposed to have a will of its own. All of the assertions made in the codex of phrases are of the same nature as this one. You have the feeling when you read it that somebody enjoyed the luxury of having enough time to transcribe everything that existed in public life in the language of the empty phrase and publish it as a codex. And do you know what this codex of phrases is called? The State. And Woodrow Wilson is its author. And this codex of phrases first appeared in the 1890s. In the 1890s, Woodrow Wilson did not intend to have the luxury of time, enough to gather together all of the phrases existing in the public sphere. But as it happens, he did. This is how little the things that people in their phrase-like existence think and say have to do with what reality comes out of it. Woodrow Wilson thought that he had published the collected political wisdom of the day, but in reality he had written a codex full of empty phrases. Several years ago, a German individual longed so strongly to eat the oats of empty phrases that he has now translated this thick book into German, so that you can now read it in German as well. I imagine that it will also be translated into other languages, but I do not know for sure. Unless we see through to the truth of these things, unless we fix our eyes on the realities of these matters, we will not move forward. Nowadays, a person will go nowhere with lesser thinking. We have to incite our feeling cores to greater thinking. Tomorrow we will speak further about that. Part 3. If you think back over what we considered yesterday and the day before, you will see that the nature of imperialism is such that in a society of people represented by the word imperialism, something that was at one time a sort of duty, a clear, if not always justified task, is carried on as time passes, almost automatically. When it comes to historical events in human evolution, it is the case that, due to a kind of inertia, we hold on to certain things that were at one time justifiable or at least explicable, things that once had reasons for existing, even though the impulses behind them have now been lost. When, at some point in history, a society of people found it necessary to defend itself, this was certainly justifiable. In the interest of defense, certain jobs were created, police officers and military positions. But after the danger against which the people had to defend themselves has passed, those positions that were created continue to exist. The society must continue to have people filling them. The people who fill those positions want to continue doing their jobs. And consequently something is created which, when you consider true relationships in the world, has no explicable reason for continuing to exist. It might even be the case that something which had once been created for defense actually becomes something aggressive. And indeed this is actually true in the case of all the imperialists, with the exception of the original imperialism of the first phase of humanity, which I spoke about 2 days ago. In that case, the justification for spreading the empire of the ruler as far and wide as possible can be derived from the fact that in the consciousness of the people at that time, a ruler was actually a god. In all of the ensuing forms of imperialism, it is fundamentally the case that the inner impulse to expand the influence of a particular empire cannot exist. Let us consider once more, from a particular perspective, what actually occurred in the historical development of humanity. We find that in the most ancient times, which we cannot fully trace in our history, but in which certain facts that can be historically traced continue to shine forth, that in these times the will of those who were looked to as godly figures was the indisputable element of power. In this stage of imperialism, there was fundamentally nothing to discuss in public life. But the reason that no discussion was possible is based on the fact that the ruler was a god, strolling about the earth in human form. This provided, if I can be permitted to say so, a sure and firm grounding for the ordering of public and social affairs. Now, gradually all of those things founded upon the basis of a firm, genuine, godly human will faded into the second phase. In the second phase, everything that can be observed in physical life, whether it be people, insignias, the actions of rulers or upper-class individuals, all of that was a symbol, a sign. Whereas in the first phase of imperialism, the spirit was thought of as existing completely within the physical world, in the second phase, everything that exists in the physical world was thought to be a reflection, an image, a symbol of things that do not exist in the physical world, but can only be depicted through the people, actions, and other things that are part of the physical world. This time, in which this second phase played itself out, is the first period in which discussion actually became possible in the world of human thought, at least as far as public affairs are concerned. In the first phase of imperialism, we actually cannot talk at all about what we now refer to as rights, We cannot talk about any sort of state institutions or structures. We can only talk about the appearance of godly figures in the form of physical human beings. We can only talk about the fact that in social affairs the concrete and true will of physical human beings was at work. At that time, the question of whether that will was justified or not made no sense. It simply was. It was to be followed. To discuss whether the God in human form should or should not do what was done was nonsensical. In those very ancient times in which the conditions existed that I have just described to you as being characteristic of them, this also did not occur. But when people began to see in the physical world around them only the image of the spiritual world, when people began to talk about what St. Augustine called the city of God, meaning a city that exists here on earth but is a reflection of heavenly structures and heavenly personalities, then it was possible for one person to believe that what these individuals who were reflecting the divine did was correct, that it was indeed an accurate reflection, whereas another person might take issue with this and could say, that is not an accurate reflection of the divine. In that we find the first possibility of a discussion. Contemporary people believe that criticism and discussion have always been present throughout the course of human evolution, because they are so used to criticizing and discussing everything. This is not the case. Discussion and criticism first appeared in the second phase of imperialism that I described to you. During that phase, it also became possible for the first time for an individual to make assessments and judgments inwardly, meaning it became possible to attach a predicate to a subject. In the most ancient forms of human expression, personal assessment simply did not exist when it came to public affairs. In the second phase of imperialism, preparations could, for the first time, begin for things such as what we now refer to as Parliament. For the idea of a Parliament only makes sense when one is able to have discussions about public affairs. So, even the most primitive form of public discussion appears first as a characteristic of the second phase of imperialism. Insofar as the characteristically Western form of imperialism has spread more or less across the entire world, we are living nowadays in the third phase. In that third phase which I have described to you, insofar as the soul life enters into our considerations as the age of the empty phrase. This phrase, imperialism, as I described it yesterday, is one in which the inner substance has vanished from discussion, and in which anyone can be right, or at least you can believe that you are right, and in which no one can prove you wrong either, because within the world of empty phrases basically any claim can be made. But early phases always continue to exist in the ones that follow upon them. This is fundamentally why the inner impulses of the imperialists continue to emerge and develop in the present. People only look at things on a very superficial level. When the early German emperor wrote his ethos in a book, quote, "The king's will is the supreme law," close quote, as he did, what does that mean? It means that in the age of the empty phrase, the emperor spoke words that would have had meaning only during the first phase of imperialism. During that first phase, it was in fact the case that the will of the ruler was the most supreme law. The idea of rights, which is always implicit in any discussion and has a string of lawyers and advocates in tow, is fundamentally a characteristic of the second phase of imperialism, and it can be understood within the context of its reality in that second phase. Anyone who has followed the many discussions about the origin and nature of rights can gather from these discussions that there is something enigmatic and opalescent in the nature of the concept itself. Because when considering rights, you are dealing with something that comes from the second age of imperialism, in which spiritual reality illuminated, shimmered behind, shone through the material world, such that when we have before us only the outer shell of the symbol, which can also be present in words and the practice of law, then it is possible to argue about the nature of rights, to take sides in a discussion in public life about rights and law. In this age of the empty phrase, we lose all understanding of how necessary it is in our social relations if we are to find an anchor for the concept of rights, for this perspective to take hold. The spiritual realm is shining here into the physical realm. And when this understanding is lost, then people start to define rights in the way that I presented to you yesterday in the example of Woodrow Wilson. Today I want to read to you word for word a definition that Woodrow Wilson offered of rights, and you will see that this definition proves itself to be nothing more than a bunch of empty words. I cited this definition yesterday, and today I want to cite it again more exactly. He writes, quote, "Law is the will of the state concerning its own organization and conduct, and the civic conduct of those under its authority." Close quote. So, the state has a will. We should imagine a man standing totally within abstract idealism, to say nothing of materialism, for the two are much the same, abstract idealism and materialism. And from that place saying, quote, "Law is the will of the state," close quote. The state supposedly has a will. You would have to be forsaken by all spirits of a more concrete perspective in order to even attempt to say or write something like this statement. But it is nonetheless found in that work that I told you about yesterday, in that codex of phraseology titled The State, Elements of Historical and Practical Politics, by Woodrow Wilson. In that same book, there are other interesting things as well. As an aside, I would like to draw your attention to one passage in which Woodrow Wilson writes about the German Empire, after saying that the efforts to found this German Empire had been going on for some time before aspiring to its present form in 1870-71. He concludes this section with the following sentences, quote, "The final impulse was given to the new processes of union by the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-71. Prussia's successes in that contest, won, as it seemed, in the interest of German patriotism, broke the coldness of the Middle States toward their great northern neighbor. They joined the rest of Germany, and the German Empire was formed." Palace of Versailles, January 18, 1871, close quote. This was written by the same man who some time later united in Versailles with those who had, in their impertinence, given the inducement for the formation of the German Empire back then. Many things in modern-day public opinion originate precisely in something like this, that humanity is so appallingly superficial and does not take care with anything. If you resolve to make judgments on the basis of objective considerations, then things always come out differently than what swims about in the contemporary public sphere and is repeated over and over again by thousands upon thousands of people. And so in the second stadium, we are dealing with something that leads to the possibility of discussion, something that actually makes possible for the first time the concept of public rights. In the third stadium, we are dealing, as we have seen, with the economic life as an actual reality. And yesterday we showed how, in the course of historical evolution, this age of the phrase is absolutely necessary, so that the phrase, no longer full of any content, can then open the eyes of human beings to the necessity of bringing spirituality, new spirituality, into the wider world. For the moment, people have only a meager imagination of this new spirituality, and for that reason it is understandable that this new spirituality faces the grossest of misunderstandings. For this new spirituality must take hold in the deepest underground places of human life, and For as much as the secret societies of the world, as regards their substance, their content, are merely traditionally preserving the old ways in their substance, in their content, the outward practice of being brothers, without bringing considerations of class in the outer world into the lodge, and without paying attention to individual subjective beliefs, is something that in a certain sense, though also something else, which I will describe to you momentarily, is preparing the future in the proper manner. Let us examine something altogether banal, entirely ordinary, that we might say nowadays, and I ask you to pay particular attention to this, quote, "The tree is green," close quote. This is a sentence that belongs entirely to the second stadium of human evolution. The tree is green. Perhaps you will understand this best if I ask you to imagine that you are to paint that which is expressed by the assessment, "The tree is green." You cannot paint this. It is impossible to paint "The tree is green." You might have a big white or some other color piece of paper and then put green color onto it, but you will be painting nothing of a tree. And if you were first to paint something of a tree without putting any green there, then you would end up with something that only addresses the object. If you wanted to paint the tree as green, you would actually have to paint a dead thing. The manner in which we join subject to predicate in our language is fundamentally useful only for our world view of dead things, of the unliving world, because we do not still possess an imagination of how everything in the world is living, and of how we are to express ourselves over and against a world in which all is living and moving. We construct sentences such as "the tree is green," which actually says that a relationship exists between something and the color green, whereas in actuality the color green is the creative element, the thing with living and effective power in this circumstance. The transformation of human thinking and feeling must take place all the way into the depths of the soul life, which will a long time from now be called forth, and this transformation will then carry into outward social relationships, into the interactions between people. In regard to all of this, we are now standing just at the very beginning stage, but we must be able to see which of the paths forward leads us toward the light. I said before, there is something significant about people coming together in such a way that the subjective beliefs of each individual play no role. And from this perspective, follow for a moment, but do it truly in your own thoughts, the way in which things are laid out in anthroposophy. Never are things described in such a way as to offer definitions or general judgments. We try, though we must deal with the fact that people do not always take it up in this manner, but nevertheless, the fundamental attempt is made to offer pictures, to describe things from the greatest variety of angles. And as such, it is actually entirely senseless when people try to nail down something truly spoken as a spiritual scientific truth to a judgment of either yes or no. There are certainly people at present who are always wanting to do this, but it is impossible. Because we are moving from out of the second stadium, they're using aside from the reader, somehow this word stadium has jumped into the text, and I'm not quite sure. But because we are moving from out of the second phase of imperialism into the third phase, the word stadium is there now, so I'm going to use it, but I believe it's synonymous with that. Because we are moving from out of the second stadium of imperialism into the third stadium, it happens over and over that somebody poses the question, what would be good for me to do, since I am struggling with this or that difficulty in my life? Advice is given. Aha, says the asker. So when I find myself in this position in life, I should do this or that. We generalize, but each situation has only a very limited meaning. For judgments that fall out of the spiritual world always have only an individual meaning, are applicable only to the particular matter at hand. This practice of generalizing, to which we are accustomed because of the experience of the second stadium of human evolution, may not be carried forward into the future. People nowadays are just so very used to taking things from the past and continuing them into the future. We can overcome the things that continue to live on perniciously in our souls by stepping back and seeing these matters with full clarity. Yesterday I indicated to you that in many ways the Catholic Church harkens back to the first stadium of imperialism. It contains in large part something like a trace or shadow of the first stadium of human evolution, a trace or shadow that was during certain periods condensed into a form of soul imperialism, for example, during the 11th century, during which time the monks from Cluny actually had much more control in Europe than people realize. From that group came the Pope Gregory VII, the powerful imperialistic pope. The fact that actually, according to the Roman Catholic dogma, the priests consider themselves to be more than the Christ because they are able to demand that the Christ be present at the altar. This fact clearly demonstrates that the institution of the Catholic Church is in fact the shadow of what once existed during the first stadium of human evolution in the most ancient form of imperialism. Now, you know that there is a great enmity between the Catholic Church and all of the societies that served as the instruments of the Freemasons, or at least a certain sect of the Freemasons, in the western areas of the world. Nowadays this enmity is spreading far and wide, and in this lecture today I can do no more to demonstrate in any specific details how this enmity has recently expanded. But one thing can be said, that in these secret societies one fact lives very strongly, namely the insight that the Catholic Church is merely the shadow of the now defunct imperialism of the first stadium. This is actually one of the most basic teachings of these secret societies, that the Catholic Church is the shadow, the last remnant of the first stadium of imperialism. The Holy Roman Empire of the German nation continued to use this frame. Charlemagne and the Ottos were crowned by the Pope, used the imperialism of the soul as a means of anointing themselves for the imperialism of the external world. They took what was already there, what had remained from ancient times, and used that mold to cast something new. In this way, the imperialism of the second stadium was cast in the frame of the first stadium of imperialism. Now, we have arrived at the third stadium, which has shown itself particularly in the western regions of the world. We have arrived at economic imperialism. This economic imperialism has as its foundation and backdrop, as I have already said, a spiritual world of secret societies that sate themselves with phrase-like symbols. But if we can see clearly that the outward constitution, the social makeup of the Church, is only a shadow of something that was formerly present and now holds no meaning, then we still are not seeing through the second stadium of imperialism, and in this we find the great state of illusion in which the present-day statesmen in particular find themselves. It is always so telling that Woodrow Wilson is able to speak of the will of the state. He would no longer be able to speak of the will of the Church, but he speaks of the will of the state, as if it were something altogether self-evident. Now the state is a carrier of the rights life, taken as a totality, as a whole, only had the meaning ascribed to it at present during the second stadium of human evolution. Whereas in the most ancient times the Church was everything, or rather that thing from which the Church resulted was everything, in the second stadium, that thing from which the state has now resulted was everything. When it comes to the Church, this has been noticed, particularly within the secret societies. When it comes to the state, it has not yet been noticed. For the time being, we continue to pour everything into the mold of the state, just as in the Middle Ages all new things were poured into the mold of the Church. Into the state we pour everything that has been united under the banner of a certain concept of freedom. The whole economic imperialism of Great Britain has been cast in the frame of the state. And all those who have been well educated in Great Britain see something self-evident in the state, something to which they can readily ascribe a will. This must also be seen clearly, however, so that this understanding of the state can go the same way as the understanding of the church went. We must recognize, when, for the collective social organism, we hold to a concept of the state as merely an institution of the rights life, and then jam everything else into this rights institution, we are perpetuating a shadow, just as the church perpetuated a shadow, as is now known to the secret societies. But there is still little consciousness of this. Think just a moment about the way in which everything that gets people worked up in outward affairs is nowadays jammed into the concept of the state. There are people who are nationalists, chauvinists, and so on. Everything that people refer to as a nation, national, chauvinist, all of this is incorporated into the frame of the state. We press nationalism into that frame and build the concept of a nationalist state. Or, let us say that someone has certain perspectives on, say, socialism, even totally radical socialism. Again, we take up the frame of the state. Instead of pressing nationalism into it, now we are forcing socialism into the frame. But people have no understanding of the fact that this frame is now only a shadowy construction, just as the makeup of the church has become a shadowy concept. In certain Protestant churches, one is given to understand that the church is just an outward institution, that the being of religion must take root in the heart of each person. This stadium of human evolution has not yet arrived as regards our understanding of the state. Otherwise, people would not have tried to press all possible nationalities into the drawing up of European borders, of national borders, after the latest military encounters. But no one is reckoning with these matters. They are not reckoning with the fact that what happens in the historical evolution of humanity is life and not mechanics. And coming into being and dying out both belong to life. But something different belongs to an imperialistic understanding. What belongs to that understanding is that one does not think at all about the future. It belongs to the whole understanding of the outward affairs of humanity at present, that people do not have any living thoughts about the future, only dead thoughts. They think today we are building something good. Today we are building something. It is good, and it will stay here forever. The feminist movement, socialism, nationalism, they all think in this manner. We are founding something now. It begins with us. People have been waiting for us, waiting for the moment when we would be this clever. But now we have come up with the cleverest thing that ever will be. It will last for all eternity. This would be more or less the same thought that I would have to have if I had raised a child until he was 18 years old, and then said to myself, now I have raised him properly, and he will stay just like he is now. He will, however, grow older, and he will also die. And it is the same way with everything that comes into being in human evolution. I have come now to what I was hinting at earlier, to what must be brought to the principle of having no concern for subjective beliefs, or to human brotherhood. What must be brought to this is the living perspective that in this earthly life we must also reckon with death. What must be brought to it is the conscious awareness. We are creating institutions in the present that must necessarily also die out, for they bear within them the principle of death. Institutions that have no desire to exist eternally, that do not think for a moment about being something ever present. But how can such a thing be realized? Well, under the influence of the thinking that comes out of the second stadium, it never will be realized. But if that feeling of shame about which I spoke yesterday enters, if we come to recognize we are living in the kingdom of the phrase, in which only economic life, only economic imperialism holds any sway, then there will be a call for the spirit that moves, though unseen, all throughout reality. There will be a call for recognition of the Spirit that speaks of the spiritual world as an invisible kingdom, as a kingdom that is not of this world, and in which consequently the Christ impulse will truly be able to take hold. There will be a call for the recognition of just such a kingdom. This can only be so when the social organism is threefolded. The economic life managing itself, the rights life serving no longer as the absolute, all-encompassing understanding of the state, and the state functioning only as the frame for that which truly lies within the rights life, and the spiritual life existing in true freedom, meaning in such a way that it can truly take form in reality as spiritual life. Spirit can move among people only when it is dependent upon nothing but itself, and when all institutions that serve the Spirit are dependent upon nothing other than themselves. What do we have then when we have this threefolded organism, this social organism? We then have an economic life. Its nature is exactly the same as the nature of the original form of imperialism. Everything that moves within it is also present entirely within life on the physical earth. In this economic branch, the managing forces must truly come out of the economic life itself. I do not believe that anyone would be of the opinion, were this economic organism to be organized in the manner described in my Kernpunkte, that anything supersensory is connected with the economic life. When we eat, when we prepare our food, when we make our clothes, this is all reality. The aesthetics of them might be symbolic, but the clothing itself is just reality. When we then examine the second branch of the social organism, we find that we do not have for the future the same kind of symbolism that existed in the second stadium of human evolution, wherein the state, the embodied rights life, was a totality. But in everything that emerges from one human being, we have a picture of that which lives in all other human beings. We have constructed the symbols anew from out of the present moment. What one human being does will always be a guide for the entire form of the social rights constitution that is constructed. And the third will not be a symbol and not a phrase. Rather, it will become spiritual reality. The Spirit will have the possibility of truly living among human beings. And so the inner social order can only be built if we truly move toward inner truthfulness. During the era of the empty phrase, however, this is particularly difficult. For in the age of the empty phrase, people are used to a certain refined cleverness. But this refined cleverness is, in actuality, fundamentally nothing more than a game with the word representations of old concepts. Think for a moment of that characteristic example, that suddenly it emerges from out of the imperialism of the phrase that it would be good for the King or Queen of England to also hold the title Emperor of India. Absolutely nothing has actually changed. Of course, many excellent reasons can be found for awarding this title, Empress of India or Emperor of India. But think about what would have happened if this were not done. Nothing would have gone differently. The Emperor of Austria, who is now among those who has been chased out of his throne, bore until the time of his ousting, among his other titles, one particularly peculiar title. It was, if I can remember them all, Franz Joseph I, Emperor of Austria, Apostolic King of Hungary, King of Bohemia, Dalmatia, Croatia, Slovenia, Galicia, Lodomeria, Illyria, and so on. Among these other titles, there was the title King of Jerusalem. The Austrian Emperor, until he was no longer Emperor, had the title King of Jerusalem. This dated back to the Crusades. There is no better way to prove the role that meaninglessness plays at present. And meaninglessness actually plays a much larger role than you might believe. What is important is that we ascend to this recognition of what is phrase-like at present. And this is made more difficult by the fact that those who are living within the phrases are simply rolling around the word representations of old concepts in their brains and believe they are thinking. But we can return truly to thinking only when we infuse our inner soul lives with substance. And this can only come out of a recognition of the spiritual world, of spiritual life. Only by infusing ourselves with spiritual life can we again become human beings full of content, after having become an intestine of the empty phrase, a phrase bowel that is altogether empty, satisfied only by word husks. Out of the feeling of shame I already hinted at yesterday will emerge a call for the Spirit. And the possibility for this Spirit to spread throughout the world will come about only if the spiritual life develops independently. Otherwise we will always have to work within little holes, as we have been forced to do with the Waldorf school, because the school regulations in Württemberg had just such a hole that made it possible to establish a Waldorf school according to purely spiritual laws, spiritual principles, something which would have been possible in almost no other place in the world nowadays. But we can truly build those things connected with spiritual life from the spiritual world only when the other two branches of the social organism do not exert their influence in it. When these things are truly taken purely out of the spiritual world. At the moment, the tendency of this age is to do just the opposite. But this tendency of the current age will never reckon with the fact that a new spiritual life will appear more and more on the earth with each new generation. It makes no difference whether an absolutist state or a Soviet republic is established now. If people move forward with the establishment of such things without a conscious awareness that everything created is subject to life and must therefore change with time and ultimately die out, must go through new forms and metamorphoses, then the only thing that they are truly preparing is that each new generation will become revolutionaries, for they will only incorporate into the social life of the present what is considered good for the immediate present. What must come forward, our foundational laws, which in the western regions of the world are still firmly secluded within the empty phrase, is the ability to see the social organism as something living. It can only be seen as something living when its threefold nature is understood. For this reason, a great, terrible, and intense responsibility lies with those who, through economic privilege, are expanding an imperialism over almost the entire world. The responsibility to become aware that the practice of a true spiritual life must be poured into this imperialism. It must be experienced as outright mockery and scorn that in the British Isles an economic empire has been founded that rules the entire world, and that then, when particularly deep mystical spirituality is desired, they turn to what has been economically conquered, economically exploited, and take their spirituality from that. We have the obligation to allow spiritual substance to flow freely from itself into the outward form of the social organism. This is the conscious awareness that I believe our British friends must take away from here. The conscious awareness that in this historical moment, all of those who belong to world organisms in which the English language is spoken have an obligation to bring true spirituality into the outward economic empire. For when it comes to this matter, it is a situation of either or. Either our strivings remain purely within the scope of the economic empire, in which case the downfall of earthly civilization is the only possible result, or spirit will be poured into this economic empire, in which case the intended results of earth evolution will actually be achieved. I would like to say here, every morning you should hold this truth before yourself and regard it solemnly, and each individual action you take should be taken with this impulse in mind. The world clock is tolling solemnly now. We have by and large reached the zenith of the empty phrase. When all content has been squeezed out of the phrase, a content that once entered it in a different form and no longer has any meaning, we must take up what can once again bring a truly substantial content to our social life and our soul life. We must be clear that the outcome of this either-or scenario is up to each individual to decide, and that each and every person must take part in this decision with his or her inner powers of soul. Otherwise we are not actually living out true human affairs. But the longing for illusions is incredibly great, particularly now in this age of the empty phrase. People would so prefer to push away the seriousness of life. People do not want to gaze upon the truth that moves through our evolution. Would people have allowed themselves to be deceived by Wilsonism if they truly possessed the inner desire to be clarified by the truth? This desire must come. The longing for truth must be awoken in humanity. Above all, the longing for the freedom of spiritual life must be awakened in humanity, along with the knowledge that one has not a right to call oneself a Christian if one does not understand what is meant by the saying, "My kingdom is not of this world." This means that the kingdom of Christ must become an invisible kingdom, a truly invisible kingdom, a kingdom that we speak about in the way we speak about things we cannot see. Only once spiritual science has begun to move amongst us will we be able to speak of such a kingdom. An outward-oriented church or state cannot bring this kingdom into reality, nor can an economic empire. Only the will of individual human beings living within a liberated spiritual life can realize this kingdom. People can scarcely believe that in those areas in which they live, the areas that are populated, much can be done for the liberation of the spiritual life. Therefore action must be taken precisely in those areas that are not already a part of the political realm, the economic realm, or obviously the soon-to-be spiritual realm. Above all, we must be infused with the knowledge that we have not yet arrived at the time when we can say, "Things have been going downhill, now everything is looking up again." No. If people do not take actions from out of the spiritual world, then things will not turn upward, but rather will continue to go downhill. Humanity does not currently live on something that it produces. For in order to produce something, we must again act under the impulses of the spiritual. Humanity is living nowadays off of reserves, of old reserves that will someday be used up. And it is childish and naive to believe that someday we will hit bottom and then suddenly everything will start to get better, even if we just sit on our hands. This is not at all the case. And the hope would be that saying something like what I have just spoken would light a fire in each person's soul that would direct them toward the anthroposophical movement. We would also hope that the spirit that so greatly haunted those who have perhaps found their way to the anthroposophical movement will be conquered by the spirit that is spoken of here. Certainly it is often true that the individuals who come toward such a movement want something for themselves, for their own souls. They can have this as well, but only when they are also able to place their souls in service to the whole. They should move further down their own paths, to be sure, but do so in such a way that the whole of humanity might also move further down its path. This cannot be said often enough. This should also be added to the other thought that I earlier said you should hold up before yourself and consider every morning. If the deepest inner impulse of this movement had been taken completely seriously, we would have been farther along in our path today. But much of what is done in our circles currently is not an advancement toward the future, but a hindrance. We must take counsel with ourselves about this fact. This is very important. And above all, we should not believe that the most potent oppositional forces are not looming over us from all sides, ready to fight against any striving toward the salvation of humanity. Several times I have pointed out to you here the things that are being done to combat this movement in the world, the animosity that has been directed toward this movement. I feel it is my responsibility to familiarize you with these things, so that you might see that you should never say to yourself, "Now we have successfully disproved this or that." We have disproved nothing, because when it comes to this kind of opposition, it is not a matter of somehow representing the truth. They make as little contact with the actual affair as possible, but then deliver defamations from as many different angles as they can. I would like to read to you a passage from a letter that arrived recently in Stuttgart from Christiania. I would just like to read one section. Quote, "Several of our anthroposophical friends are working together at a so-called adult education center in Christiania with one Schirmer. This Herr Schirmer is in one sense a very capable teacher, but is also a fanatical racist and a sworn anti-Semite. At a recent gathering at which 3 of us gave lectures on the threefold social order, he sought to argue against us, or rather against the Kernpunkte from Dr. Steiner, though without any particular success. The chap holds some sway among circles of teachers, and he is working on his own in a manner not dissimilar to the threefold social order, insofar as he represents freedom and lively objectiveness to the children he teaches. But still he is working against the threefold social order and Dr. Steiner for the simple reason that he harbors a suspicion that Dr. Steiner is a Jew. This is probably not actually so terrible. No doubt we must expect and overcome far more and greater oppositions than this. But now he has received confirmation of his suspicion. He turned to an, in quotes, authority, namely to the editor of the political anthropological monthly Berlin Steglitz. This monthly, which is outright anti-Semitic, wrote to him that Dr. Steiner is a Jew through and through. He has connections with the Zionists, actually is tied to them directly. And the editor added that they, the anti-Semites, have had their eye on you for quite some time. Herr Schirmer went on to explain that an outright persecution of the Jews is now beginning in Germany, and that all Jews currently on the blacklists of the anti-Semites should simply be gunned down, or as they say, rendered harmless. Close quote, and so on. You see, the crux of the matter here has nothing to do with something that is in any way anti-Semitic. That is simply the surface layer. In connection with situations like these, people use insults with which they are able to communicate as much as possible to those who somehow hear those insults. But such things also point to something that most people nowadays do not want to see, something about which they would rather continue to deceive themselves. It is much more serious today than you would like to think. And what is important is that we do not misjudge the gravity of this time, but rather become clear about the fact that when it comes to such things, things that work against everything that we mean when we speak of the forward progress of humanity, we are seeing only the beginning, and that we may never, without doing harm to our obligations, turn our gaze away from everything now appearing in the form of a radical evil within humanity, everything now being realized as radical evil within humanity. The worst thing that can happen now is to believe, having listened to insults and empty phrases, that everything that verbalization gives to old concepts and understanding, that all of that still is somehow rooted in human reality, and that we do not draw forth a new reality from the founts of the spiritual world itself. This, my dear friends, was something of what I wanted still to say to you today, what I wanted to say first and foremost for all of you, but particularly for those whose visit we have so heartily enjoyed, particularly for our English friends, that after their return they might direct their behavior and actions there, where it will be important for them to do so, out of a certain knowledge and awareness. You will have noticed that here I have not spoken well or ill of anyone. I have not spoken to flatter anyone. Here I have spoken simply to communicate the truth. I have also come to know theosophists. When they have spoken to people from a foreign country, they began their talk about what an honor it is to be able to spread the teachings of spiritual life within the borders of that great nation that had gained so much glory for itself. I could not speak to you here in such a manner, but I think that you all came to hear the truth, and I believe that in this manner I have served you as best I can, in that I attempted to speak the unadorned truth. You will have seen from these lectures that to speak the truth nowadays is not a comfortable thing, for the truth calls up more opposition now than ever before. Do not shy away from this opposition, for in this time the two are one and the same, having enemies and speaking the truth. These things must be seen for what they are, and we will understand them best when we also have as a foundation for this oppositional understanding the desire always to hear the truth. This is what I wanted to say today, both to the group at large and in particular to our English friends, in my last lecture to you before my trip to Germany.